Begin with altitude, not with thrones. The best Andes are a ladder no one can climb in a straight line, a world stacked in terraces of heat and cold, river and rock, fog and snow, each band growing a different hunger and a different solution. Along the Pacific, a desert so dry it keeps its dead, as if time were a courteous guest, is cut by narrow green fingers of river oases. In the middle elevations, temperate valleys cradle maize and fruit. Higher up, the air thins until words turn short, but potatoes and quinoa answer the challenge, and beyond them lies the Puna, a grassland ruled by camelids and wind. On the eastern face, the mountains fall toward cloud forests that smell of wet bark and distant thunder, where coca leaves, parrot feathers, and hardwoods stand outside the temper of frost. This is the first map the future Inca inherit, not a flat field to be surveyed, but a vertical puzzle to be solved by motion. Motion becomes the culture. Households refuse to gamble everything on a single altitude. Kin groups knit their lives into a vertical archipelago, maintaining plots at different heights, trading tubers for maize, wool for salt, coca for dried fish, hauled north from the cold blooming Humboldt Current. A family's security is measured not only in how much land it holds, but in how many elevations it can touch. The habit of sending cousins to distant terraces and nephews to shepherd in high meadows is not sentiment. It is a portfolio strategy. It teaches children to read the angle of a slope like an accountant reads a ledger. It forces calendars to talk to one another, harvesting low while the high fields sleep, planting high while the coast fogs. It trains bodies to carry information as easily as loads, because in a world without writing, people are the couriers of memory. Surplus emerges first, where river meets desert. In places like the Soup Valley, irrigation cuts logic into sand. Canals teach rhythm, clear silt at the right week, open gates when the moon says so, close before the flood. The reward is predictable food. Anchovy and sardine hauled from a cold sea add protein that doubles the power of grain. Cotton grown in the irrigated strips makes nets to catch more fish and textiles to clothe more workers, and suddenly some hands are free to build. Platform mounds and sunken plazas rise like manifestos in adobe and stone, not as palaces of a single tyrant, but as calendars made visible, places where a community can assemble, count itself, exchange vows, and practice the choreography of labor. Monumentality here is not waste, it is rehearsal for coordination at scale. Belief ties distances together before government does. In a highland sanctuary, like Chavine, where stone corridors hum with the memory of flutes, and an image of a fanged being stares from carved pillars, pilgrims arrive in a mood that mixes fear and curiosity. They carry offerings from many valleys and return with a common vocabulary etched in their eyes. Iconography spreads along llama routes, feline mouths, serpent hair, condor wings, a pantheon of crossbred power that speaks in a grammar shared by people who have never shared a ruler. Priests become the first civil engineers of meaning, staging processions that flow like water through controlled channels, imposing schedule on ecstasy, blending medicine and theology into an authority that needs no garrison. The lesson is simple: move symbols first, and bodies will follow later with less resistance. Regional craft states make the lesson practical. On the parched south coast, engineers lean into the land with Pucchio's spiraling access shafts to underground aqueducts that pull water from the earth without losing it to sun or wind. In the north, irrigation kingdoms bind their fortunes to rivers and canals. Leaders stand atop adobe huacas, performing rites so theatrical that later viewers mistake them for simple cruelty or gaudy vanity. But beneath the spectacle lies accounting. A sacrifice on a platform is a public affirmation that someone controls the calendar, and therefore the water, and therefore the bread. Ceramics paint the story in endless repetition. Warriors, lords, harvests, animals, gods. Pots become a medium for broadcasting rules and expectations, a portable code of images that travels with salt, dried fish, obsidian, and gossip. Then comes scale in the highlands. One capital grows tidy and orthogonal, stamping provincial compounds with right angles and repeating rooms, each blockable, countable, legible, to inspectors who need to know how many mouths a warehouse can feed and for how many days. Another center, anchored on the altiplano around a shining lake, stacks megaliths into solemn courts, and reaches into the fields with raised platforms that capture sun by day and hold water by night to fend off frost. These are different architectural dialects, speaking the same administrative language. Standardize your building so your officials are never lost. Multiply storage so famines become logistics problems rather than apocalypses. Stitch roads into ridges and riverbanks until a messenger can predict his own endurance. Fold ritual into travel so audits look like pilgrimages and taxes smell like incense. When droughts thicken or trade routes pivot and these giants falter, their habits do not die. They seed the hills with experience. The centuries that follow are often called a period of fragmentation, but that word lies. Fragmentation suggests breakage and loss. The Andes instead become a mosaic of smaller powers that know more than their ancestors did. Canal builders on the north coast concentrate in cities of dust and geometry, where walls keep not only enemies out, but also administrative logic in. Sailors hug the coast, trading and spying with equal ease. Highland lordships fortify spines and promontories with stone teeth, practice quick violence at dawn, and negotiate by noon because tomorrow there will be terraces to mend and herds to keep moving. Around Lake Titicaca, pastoral wealth migrates under the sun, a kind of capital that walks and multiplies, answering a different clock than May's, but a clock no less strict. Names of feared confederations spread like weather reports through valleys, where every household knows how to sling a stone and dress a llama. Legibility increases without literacy. Quipple-like chords appear in small, practical ways, even before they become the state's full nervous system. Knots and colors stand in for numbers and categories. Chords hang from chords like family trees of obligation. Trained minds rehearse what the chords say until muscle remembers the sums. Textiles carry data in patterns only the initiated fully read. Who belongs where, who owes what, which cloth is suitable for which office. Ceremonies encode law. The order of a procession tells you the order of a society. The rhythm of drums tells you when to plant. A culture built to remember with bodies and breath can scale in surprising ways, because everyone is already a page and a scribe. Violence remains, but its economics are understood. Hilltop fortresses frown over valleys, and raiders test their luck on slopes that force them into narrow files within range of disciplined slingers. Herds change hands, and with them the balance of pride. Yet even hardened chiefs come to accept that annihilating an enemy elite is often the least profitable option. Better to reseat rivals under new patronage, pull their sons into your household as guests who do not quite know they are hostages, and swap sisters so that blood and alliance become synonyms. The etiquette of capture and release evolves into a technology of incorporation. People learn to switch banners without surrendering their fields, to pay with labor rather than coin, and to treat obedience as seasonal. This is not cynicism, it is survival in a landscape where a winter can feel like a verdict. On the north coast, a canal monarchy consolidates into a coherent machine. Its capital is a city of walled compounds, each one a living palace that will become a ruler's cult estate after death. Wealth is stored in rooms large enough to astonish and counted by specialists who can smell theft by the way dust lies on a floor. Artisans are not left to their whims. They are assigned, moved, concentrated, recombined, a human metallurgy that alloys skilled hands into stronger institutions. Justice is a rhythm. Clean canals in this month, deliver fiber in that one, present so many fish, so many jars of beer, so many cloaks. When inspectors arrive, the correct numbers feel less like demands than like the return of a well known season. This is administration without paper, and it works. Now place Cusco in that world. The valley is lovely, four rivers, laying threads of water through broad fields, defensible ridges, a sky that sharpens colors in the dry months. The people who will later claim half a continent are at this point one among many who know how to terrace slopes and fight neighbors. What sets them apart blooms slowly. They split the town into two moieties, so that power can move without breaking. They lace the basin and surrounding ridges with ceremonial lines radiating from a central temple. Along these lines, shrines are fixed like beads. Each one holds a story, a ritual, a week. To walk the line is to read a calendar no one has written. To bless at each shrine is to count attendance, tally offerings, notice absences, and hear grievances, while everyone pretends the only thing happening is devotion. Religion becomes a civic algorithm. Roads begin as habits, shepherd paths scouted by keen hooves, and careful feet find ridges that keep one above floods. Valley tracks learn to skirt boulders that roll without warning in the rainy season. Villages expand way stations into resting places for caravans. The distances between these places begin to rhyme with one another. A runner can measure his breath in the number of hills until the next shelter. A train of llamas learns the cadence of halts so well that an inexperienced boy can lead them by watching the ears of the lead animal. Knowledge settles into the routes, and the routes become a skeleton upon which muscle can later be layered. Memory centralizes without erasing local pride. Specialists are trained to tie and untie meanings with chords. They travel, they are tested, they recite in public. A wrong sum is a public embarrassment. A right one is a communal relief. People begin to trust that obligations can be tracked beyond the reach of one village's gossip, that trust is oxygen for ambition. It permits the dream that one city can know and provision dozens of valleys at once without being accused of sorcery. Food becomes the quiet language of authority. In a land where drought can turn a household tragic in a month, a full storeroom is mercy draped in wood and stone. When delegations arrive in Cusco, granaries breathe out, and beer flows until shyness retreats. Guests return home with the taste of security on their tongues. Officials never say the loud part out loud because they don't need to. A place that eats this well will not let its clients starve. That reputation is worth more than 1,000 spears in a season of weak rains. It is also expensive to maintain. The pressure to keep bins heavy polices laziness more effectively than fear. Irrigation ditches are admonished like unruly children. Terraces are groomed like animals. One loves calendars are obeyed with the intensity of prayer because error means hunger. In a region dense with capable rivals, the difference between dominance and obscurity often comes as a crisis that selects for the right kind of nerve. A feared confederation advances, and the valley shakes with the sense that its number has been called. Some leaders calculate paths of retreat. Others look at the arrangement of streets and shrines and think in terms of funnels and kill zones. The stand that follows, whether or not later storytellers exaggerate its scale, reorganizes status. Cowards become obvious in the rearview mirror. Competence juts forward like a new ridge. Afterward, the city is not the same. The people have learned who they want to follow and who should be thanked and retired. They have learned that improvisation isn't the enemy of order if the improviser understands the geometry of his own streets. Once that selection has been made, everything the valley has practiced comes into harmony. The vertical archipelago ceases to be a family habit and becomes a doctrine the city can impose and coordinate. Rotational labor, already sanctified by custom, is renamed and structured so that the same hands that build a neighbor's roof on Tuesday can build a public road on Thursday with no moral friction. The seek lines, once purely sacred walkways, double as inspection loops. The etiquette of switching loyalties under pressure becomes policy. Incorporate elites, foster their children, translate their gods into the city's calendar. Let new subjects keep a name for themselves that fits inside the larger name of the state. Bureaucracy, ritual, engineering, and hospitality stand shoulder to shoulder. Each practice intensifies the others. None of this is destiny. The mountains punish foolishness, regardless of pedigree. But a culture that has taught itself to treat altitude as an ally, time as a braided set of obligations, and memory as a thing carried in bodies, is already primed for scale. The first great empire of the Andes will not spring from nowhere. It will assemble itself from parts scattered across centuries, canals that refuse drought, roads that anticipate armies, storehouses that domesticate fear, rituals that double as censuses, textiles that speak rank without wasting breath, and the stubborn sense that to organize well is to be righteous. When outsiders later stand in front of walls that tilt inward with improbable grace and wonder how such stones came to kiss, the correct answer will not be a single king's name. It will be an older chorus. Altitude taught us to count. Famine taught us to plan. Faith taught us to show up on time. And when all three finally agreed, a valley learned how to govern more than itself. Cusco learns early that power is not a shout, but a geometry. The basin sits like a palm open to four valleys, and the people who claim it organize themselves as if the hand must always balance its fingers. They divide into moieties, upper and lower, Hanan and Hurin, not as rivals, but as counterweights. Each half supplies offices, priests, generals, and stewards. Each half mirrors the other so that no ritual stands alone and no decision is allowed to harden into tyranny without its twin asking questions. This is not an abstraction. It is practiced daily in who leads processions, who speaks first at councils, who marries whom, and which lineages hold which keys. A city arranged in paired obligations trains its rulers to think in symmetry, to prefer equilibrium over drama, and to frame ambition as service to a balance older than any single man. Myth becomes the civic charter. The stories say that founders walk out of a cave or rise from the waters of a sacred lake, carrying a golden rod that will sink into the one place the earth itself approves. They travel until the rod disappears into Cusco's soil, a sign that the land consents to be governed. It is a tale of consent masquerading as miracle, a political claim told as pilgrimage. When later rulers cite it, they are not asking people to believe in magic. They are reminding them that authority arrived by a negotiated discovery, that the ground chose the capital as much as the capital chose the ground. The founding couple is remembered not for conquest but for teaching how to plant, how to weave, how to make a household steady. Governance is framed as instruction, kingship as pedagogy. To obey is to continue learning, to rule is to continue teaching. A city that roots obedience in literacy of land and craft can command without issuing threats on every page. The Sikh system grows from this idea of consent, braided into obligation. From the temple at the center, lines radiate outward like ligaments, each line a root studded with huakas, springs with voices, boulders with names, hilltops that look like sleeping animals, fields where ancestors did something once and never really left. To the uninitiated, it appears as a necklace of holy places. To those who carry chords and numbers in their minds, it is a schedule and a map layered into one. Officials and priests walk these lines in the right order, at the right times, and in doing so, they transform devotion into audit. Offerings presented at each node become counts of households and herds. Ceremonies double as censuses. The absence of a face at a shrine is both a spiritual lapse and an administrative red flag. The rhythm of ritual is thus identical to the rhythm of governance. No one thinks they are being inspected because inspection wears the costume of festival. Architecture answers with the same logic. The Coricancha breathes sunlight like a deliberate machine. Stones lean inward at angles that steady the building against Earth's shiver, and doorways stack in alignments that turn walking into choreography. Processions are not allowed to meander. They are guided along routes that make the crowd legible. Courtyards scale bodies into units that can be counted from a doorway. The city becomes a device for measuring itself, each plaza a dial, each alley a wire, each terrace a register where the year's labor can be read in the angle of a wall. Even the way stones are cut and married, polygons pressed until seams vanish, broadcasts a lesson. If stone can be persuaded to fit without mortar, people can be persuaded to fit without chains. Precision is the argument, endurance is the proof. Lineage is given architecture as well. A ruler's house is never merely his home, it is the address of his afterlife, the headquarters of his cult, the engine of his ongoing political presence. When a sovereign dies, his estate does not flow into his successor's pockets. It remains active, staffed by retainers, fed by lands assigned to it, sustaining feasts and rites that keep his name bright. The living cannot easily raid the dead. The new ruler must found his own palace and secure new lands and labor to fund his own immortality. This is costly, which is the point. The cost forces expansion, ingenuity, and attention. It also forces administrative clarity. Who belongs to which house, which fields owe grain, to which name, which workshops weave for which cult. All must be tracked. In such a city, ancestor worship is not a haze of incense, it is an economy with strict books. Marriage and fostering turn enemies into uncles. Daughters travel outward as consorts and cement, stitching distant families to the capital with children who will speak two loyalties in one language. Sons of provincial nobles spend formative years inside Cusco's precincts, eating bread from the city's storehouses, wearing the city's cloth, learning to interpret omens in the city's style. When they return to their valleys, they dream in Cusco's calendar. Conquest later will look like the formalization of an affection already planted. The soft power of hospitality, rooms set aside for guests, kitchens that never go cold, beer poured until strangers become cousins, does more than win friends. It standardizes expectation. A lord who has tasted festival in the capital will want to copy it at home, and copying rituals is the first step toward copying laws. Roads are coaxed into being by repetition. Messenger relays learn to breathe at predictable intervals. Way stations brighten like embers along routes that used to be trails of chance. A runner departs with a knotted cord and a phrase burned into memory and arrives breathless at a tampu where another runner grabs the message and sprints on. The message beats the llama caravan by days, and the llama beats a rumor by weeks. And so the center knows before the periphery has finished arguing about what has happened. Speed is a kind of mercy when famine or flood strikes. It is also a tool of discipline when obligations drift. A city that can reach itself quickly cannot be surprised for long. Food gives the system its moral center. Storehouses rise like low hills bulging with dried potatoes, maize, salted meat, chili, beans, and cloth stacked in bundles that are as much currency as clothing. Granaries are situated not only near the capital, but along the routes that tie quarters to quarters. A string of stomachs space the distance of a hard day's walk. Administrators do not think of grain as treasure, they think of it as time. How many days can this district live if the sky closes? How many work parties can be fed if a bridge collapses and must be replaced in a fortnight? The answers live in silent rooms guarded not by soldiers but by reputations, because everyone knows which storehouses are full and which ones are a lie told by a lazy steward. Pilgrims and delegations who eat from these reserves taste more than generosity. They taste a promise that obedience will be repaid with survival. Cloth speaks where texts do not. Patterns announce office. Colors announce quarter. Certain tunics can be worn only by those who have completed certain labors, and the seeing of them in a plaza compresses paragraphs of law into a glance. Workshops organized under the roofs of palaces and temples turn raw fiber into an encoded public language. A traveler entering Cusco could read the square without a single inscription: who commands, who serves, who petitions, who inspects. Metal joins in the chorus. Ears, pools, diadems, and plates do not merely glitter, they authorize ornament as a file cabinet worn on the body. Record keeping matures from household competence to state profession. Specialists learn to bind numbers and categories into chords with knots that can be audited aloud, recited in front of witnesses who know the right totals because they walked the Sikh last season and saw the herds with their own eyes. A man who can reproduce a district's obligations knot for knot is prized like a fine weapon. He travels with delegates, sits in provincial halls, and binds the far places to the center with a consistency that earns trust. When disputes arise, correction begins with ceremony. The calendar is invoked, the route retraced, the shrine visited, the cords retied in public. The repair of an error is staged as a cure for disorder rather than a punishment for sin. People leave believing the system is sound, and soundness is half of sovereignty. The frontier between sacred and administrative is erased by use. A hill designated as a huaca has a festival that demands attendance. Attendance is counted and becomes proof of capacity. Capacity justifies a request for labor next month on a terrace wall the flood bit through. The same official who burns incense today will inspect canal silt tomorrow. No one feels whiplash because the roles are fused in one person without apology. This intimacy between faith and policy keeps the machine from grinding. Orders are softened by song, inspections scented with smoke, taxes timed to feasts, and every unpleasant demand housed in a narrative that makes it feel like continuity rather than extraction. Defenses wrap the city without posturing. Hilltop fortifications are sharpened, garrisons drilled, magazines filled with sling stones, but the walls closest to the heart of the city are not there to frighten neighbors. They are there to reassure citizens that their labor is protected against the mountain's temper. When an earthquake comes and stones settle back into perfect seams, the people learn again that their rulers choose methods that anticipate insult. Confidence grows less from victory than from the absence of collapse. In this century and a half, Cusco turns its basin into an instrument. The moieties keep decision making elastic without becoming mush. The founding myth keeps authority intimate with land and craft. The Sikh grid binds time to place and converts piety into policy. Palaces harden pedigrees into institutions that outlive their first owners and therefore demand continuous expansion to fund the living's ambitions. Hospitality pulls rivals into the city's gravity until they cannot imagine a calendar without its festivals. Roads stretch, way stations breathe, runners knit districts together by the hour. Storehouses convert harvest into schedule and schedule into law. Textiles and metal ornaments replace writing, broadcasting rank and function in colors and shine. Quipu trained specialists discipline memory into chords that can be verified without blood, and the border between altar and office dissolves until no one can remember a time when the two were not the same room. By the end of this phase, the city does not need to announce itself as a capital. The valleys surrounding it have already begun arranging their lives to its rhythm. Elites will continue to test it. Droughts will try to humiliate it. Enemies will climb toward it with intentions sharpened by envy. But the core is built a culture that can ask and be answered across mountains without panic, a people who feel counted and therefore seen, a landscape taught to arrive where and when it should. The basin that once held a town now holds a habit of governance, sturdy enough to step beyond its ridges and expect the world outside to learn its songs. The city that has learned to count itself now has to learn to survive itself. Lineages jostle under the polished calm of ritual, and succession is a narrow bridge over a canyon. Inca Roca steps onto that bridge with the confidence of a man raised inside geometry. He inherits not a quiet patrimony, but a basin full of bright cousins and watchful neighbors, each measuring Cusco's strength by the steadiness of its calendar and the breadth of its storehouses. The ruler's first task is not conquest, it is containment. He makes the city's pairwise balance feel inevitable again, repairs the little fractures where moiety pride had sharpened into grievance, and insists, by festival and inspection, that the secret still binds time to place more tightly than any rival can bind spear to hand. In doing so, he buys space to practice the art that will define the coming decades, turning every external pressure into an interior lesson. That lesson begins with sons and walls. The household of a sovereign is not a private affair. It is a factory where future offices are cast. Inca raises princes in public, letting the city watch how each young man carries cloth, listens at councils, responds when messengers bring rain news or canal failures. The ruler who cannot be everywhere at once trains eyes to be everywhere for him. Within Cusco's precincts, workshops for stone and textile grow more disciplined, their output more standardized, because uniformity is a quiet language of reassurance. If a storeroom lintel looks like every other lintel in the quarter, if doorways align with the same courtesy to procession, then a farmer arriving at the capital knows the state has not drifted. Habit is the softest form of force. Beyond the basin, the chessboard is busy. Highland confederations move along ridges with the brittle confidence of men used to winning. The Kala and the Lupaka weigh each other around a cold lake, like stags testing antlers at dawn. North Coast Canal kings extend feelers up the valleys, tasting whether new tribute can be siphoned by flattery or fear. The Chanka, with reputations sharpened by song, roam the rumor maps of the Central Sierra. Cusco cannot afford to posture. It cultivates cousins. Daughters travel as gifts, dressed in law, carrying with them the capital's calendar and the memory of its feasts. Sons of neighboring elites arrive to be polished into courtiers who smell of Cusco's smoke and think in its geometry. When they ride home, their landscapes seem slightly misaligned until their villages begin to imitate the capital's rhythms. The work is slow, repetitive, and cheaper than war. War comes anyway, because mountains breed appetite as reliably as potatoes breed eyes. Inca Roca's successors inherit a city that can feed, count, and host, but must now prove it can repel. Yahor Huacach grows up with his name soldered to tears, a story later told about a childhood ransom and a prince's weeping that stains his title. Whether the tale is history or theater, the effect is the same. Cusco's elite learns that the cost of indecision is humiliation. The court's appetite for preemption sharpens. Garrison hilltops nearest the basin are deepened, slingstone magazines refreshed, approaches mapped with the same precision that once mapped festivals. Messengers' relays are drilled not only for speed in good times, but for endurance under stress. The road spurs that used to be courtesies to caravans harden into arteries meant to deliver anger precisely. Diplomacy turns carnivorous without losing its smile. Marriage alliances are paired with quiet hostage taking, disguised as fostering. Ritual invitations to great feasts come with seating charts that teach who stands where when war is whispered. At the same time, the city begins to experiment with reshuffling populations to dampen sparks before they catch. Families known for proud tempers are invited, compelled to settle a valley away, where their rivalries have no ready purchase. Artisans with rare skills are gathered from distant communities and rehoused near palaces that value their hands. Their home lords accept this as honor because the capital's attention is a currency few can refuse. The movement of people is framed as ceremony, but its purpose is administrative. Break local feedback loops, increase dependence on the center, and make rebellion less likely to start and harder to coordinate if it does. Storehouses multiply just beyond the familiar circle of the basin. The city discovers the political value of granaries, placed 2 or 3 hard days out, stocked to astonish, managed by stewards who understand that generosity is a weapon with a longer reach than spears. When a nearby lord hesitates to bend, a lean year and a full Tampu warehouse make the conversation simple. People eat where obedience grows. The reputation that Cusco feeds when the sky withholds becomes an argument no frontier sermon can counter. A village that is eaten from a state bin once will not forget the taste of security. Its young men will not argue long when the call comes to raise a terrace wall on the capital's timetable rather than the valley's whim. The calendar grows teeth, rotational labor hardens into schedule, and schedule becomes identity. If a district is known for building bridges, its people begin to speak about themselves as the hands of spans. If another keeps canal mouths clear, its festival banners show water as law and silt as sin. Pride follows function, and function serves the center. Inspectors walking the Sikhs learn to hear these new identities and play them like instruments, tuning the empire to be by flattery as often as by threat. A people who believe they excel at a public task will complain if they are not asked to perform it, and that complaint is a trap that hooks them deeper into the system. Yahwar Huakig's court confronts the Chanka with a mixture of ritual bravado and practical fear. Songs composed in Cusco practice victory before it happens, teaching feet the celebratory steps in advance, as if muscle memory could reach into the future and pull it closer. Meanwhile, walls are graded, kill zones scribed into fields, fallback positions rehearsed with the same exactness that processions require. The stories told later make this period a drama of miracle and terror, but beneath the theater is a city learning to turn every public act into a rehearsal for contingency. Festivals double as musters, pilgrimages double as surveys of road condition, offerings to a hill hoka double as a way to bring 1,000 bodies to the same slope where next season a fort's foundation trench will be dug. Viracocha Inca comes to power with the aftertaste of near disaster on everyone's tongue. He is less a conqueror at first than a stabilizer, a ruler who understands that confidence is an asset you can spend only once and slowly rebuild. He moves with a craftsman's patience. Architectural projects tighten the capital's lines, polishing precincts until even skeptics must admit that stone laid by this hand will not crack soon. He travels outward with the court, a moving theater of plenty that demonstrates, valley by valley, what membership buys, stored food opened at need, rituals that elevate local gods into the empire's choir, gifts of cloth whose patterns enroll recipients into a grammar of rank that can be read across days of travel. Where resistance is sharp, he pairs gift with removal, detaching sharp families from their roots and replanting them on soil that dulls them. Under Viracocha, the relay road becomes less a courtesy and more an axiom. Distances are measured in breath an hour, way stations spaced so reliably that a trained runner's body becomes a clock. This changes governance at its core. News of a frost at altitude arrives, while maize is still green at lower bands. Labor can be redirected from a festival troupe to a terrace repair crew before resentment has time to find its words. The center begins to behave as if it has peripheral senses. It knows earlier, reacts sooner, pretends prescience, but in truth just runs on time that has been squeezed of slack. A state that touches itself quickly feels immortal to its subjects, because delay is the chink most people recognize in power. Quipu practice deepens. What began as household competence and temple convenience becomes a vocation with prestige and tests. Men trained to sing numbers into chords are now required to reproduce entire districts from memory on public demand. Errors are corrected ceremonially to preserve confidence, but repeat offenders lose cloak privileges and guest rights at key feasts, the kind of punishments that bite without blood. The point is psychological. The chords are not merely tools, they are the state's conscience worn on the outside. If they can be trusted, then distant promises can be believed, and if promises can be believed, then summons can be obeyed without a garrison in every valley. Viracocha's court treats violence as a punctuation mark rather than a paragraph. When he strikes, it is quick, at a hinge point, paired with an immediate ritual that redefines the moment as restoration rather than theft. A defeated lord is invited to a festival that places his ancestors' names in a new order within the capital's liturgy. His sons are kept nearby under splendid pretexts. His artisans are honored and reassigned. His god is given a small house near the temple with a schedule that makes it sing on the empire's time. Domination is made to feel like inclusion. The lie works because it is half true. The polity can only scale if it keeps what it conquers recognizable to the conquered. By the late years of Viracocha, Cusco stands at a threshold. It is built plank by plank without calling it a bridge. The basin's machine hums moieties balance, seeks count, palaces fix the dead to the living and force the living outward, roads breathe, storehouses set the tempo, textiles speak law, chords remember truth, and rituals take the bite out of orders so they can be swallowed. The neighbors have learned the taste of its hospitality and the weight of its displeasure. The young men who will later lead armies have grown up running relays, reciting inventories, reading cloth, and watching their elders convert misfortune into policy and policy into myth without losing their place in the song. Crisis has not ended. It has been domesticated. Opportunity has not arrived. It has been manufactured. The lineages inside the capital still feel the heat of rivalry, but now rivalry is channeled into projects with dates and measurements rather than coups with knives and night. The enemies beyond the ridges still test the borders, but now borders are buffered by communities that eat from the capital's warehouses and celebrate on its schedule. A prince raised in this world will wake one morning to an attack that threatens to collapse the fiction of inevitability and will answer not with invention from nothing, but with a sudden, ruthless application of habits his city has been rehearsing for 2 generations. The test comes in the form of the Chanka. They arrive with a reputation sharpened by centuries of raids, their advance marked in rumor long before their boots and slings appear on Cusco's ridges. To many in the city, this looks like the end. The ruling Inca, Viracocha, retreats with part of the nobility, preferring survival to confrontation. But one prince, remembered by later mouths as Pachacuti, refuses to flee. His choice is not framed as destiny in the moment. It is framed as insolence, as audacity, as the gamble of a man who believes the city itself can be turned into a weapon. That gamble succeeds, and the victory rewrites not only Cusco's future, but the way the Andes understand what a state can be. The aftermath matters more than the clash. Pachacuti seizes power not just by inheritance, but by proof. He reorganizes what remains of the court, forcing rivals to accept that competence has spoken louder than lineage. He rebuilds Cusco as if to prove to gods and men that the city is no longer a basin town, but a cosmic center. Streets are remade with deliberate angles, plazas are widened to swallow larger assemblies, and the Temple of the Sun becomes a jewel box of gold and polished stone that frames Inta not only as a deity, but as the empire's patron shareholder. The physical city is a manifesto, its walls tilt inward, stones locked in puzzle perfection, not a gap for a blade of grass. Architecture becomes propaganda. If stone can be persuaded into obedience, so can people. Administration crystallizes under his hand. The Sikh system that once tied shrines to schedules becomes the skeleton of an empire. He divides his domain into four suis, quarters that radiate like extensions of the cosmic order, each with its own direction, identity, and obligations. The capital is declared the navel of the world, the axis where the quarters meet. This is more than metaphor. By assigning every community a place in one of the four quadrants, he fixes their obligations into a map. Tribute, labor, and ritual attendance are no longer floating negotiations, they are coordinates. To manage this, Pachacuti expands the use of the MIDI, what had been a rotational custom among neighbors, is repurposed as a state engine. Every household owes labor at scheduled intervals, on terraces, on canals, on roads, on fortresses. In return, the state feeds and clothes the workers from its storehouses. No coin changes hands, but the reciprocity is institutionalized, scaled beyond the village into something continental. The people do not feel taxed in the sense of loss. They feel enrolled in a machine where their turn comes, and then another's, and the whole continues to breathe. It is obligation disguised as fairness, and it makes projects possible on a scale no village alone could attempt. Logistics follow. Roads are not just repaired, they are multiplied, straightened, spurred into valleys that never dreamed of being so close to the center. Way stations are set at regular intervals, stocked with food, weapons, and blankets. Messengers can now carry orders across mountains at speeds that seem supernatural to those who still live in the slower rhythms of isolated valleys. Soldiers can march and know that every day's end will meet them with shelter and provisions. The empire becomes portable, its strength present wherever its roads reach. Data management becomes a craft with teeth. Quipikameoks, the keepers of cords, are trained and inspected. Their work is not decoration, but the empire's nervous system. Knots and colors track tribute, census, and obligations, and their accuracy is checked by redundancy and ritual. Memory ceases to be merely familial or priestly, it becomes bureaucratic. The empire knows itself because chords remember what mouths alone could never hold without distortion. Information flows upward and orders flow downward, stitched together by cords that hang like roots binding soil. Pachacuti does not rely on force alone. He practices absorption as art. Defeated lords are invited into the capital, given houses and wives, taught to walk in the empire's rituals. Their gods are brought to Cusco, housed in niches near the great temple, made to sing in chorus with Inte. Whole communities are moved, resettled into valleys where their pride cannot ferment rebellion, their labor redirected into terraces and fortresses that serve the center. These Mitmakuna transplanted colonists spread loyalty and dependency at once. The policy dilutes resistance and spreads imperial culture as naturally as seeds caught in wind. War remains essential. Pachacuti campaigns outward, seizing valleys and highlands, testing his new system under fire. Victories are followed immediately by construction, fortresses planted on ridges, roads cut into stubborn slopes, canals drawn to water new terraces. Defeat is met not with annihilation, but with reorganization. Elites who submit are preserved and rebranded. Those who refuse are crushed swiftly to set an example. The empire's violence is strategic punctuation. The sentence is always integration. By the time Pachacuti ages, Cusco has ceased to be a city among rivals. It has become the head of a body stretching over deserts, mountains, and forests. Its plazas are filled with goods from climates its farmers will never see. Its rituals are attended by men whose grandparents thought Cusco a rumor. Its storehouses bulge with food that makes famine into policy rather than tragedy. Its roads carry messengers who outrun fear. Its cords bind numbers that make promises believable. Its walls tell every visitor that obedience is rational because endurance is visible in stone. What began as the audacity of a prince refusing to flee has hardened into a revolution of system. Cusco no longer needs to argue that it is the center. It has built itself into the proof. When Pachacuti's son takes the fringe work of empire into his own hands, he inherits more than a throne. He inherits a machine humming with roads, warehouses, rituals, and labor schedules. A machine that has proven itself capable of binding valleys and highlands. Topa Inca Yupanqui decides to test its limits by pushing it across deserts, coasts, and rivers until it spans a geography so broad that even seasoned couriers gasp at the distances. Where his father made Cusco the navel of the world, Topa Inca sets out to make the world fit inside Cusco's orbit. Northward lies Chamor, the Canal Kingdom, whose adobe capital, Chan Chan, sprawls across the coast like a city built of dried riverbeds. Its lords have perfected bureaucracy, organizing artisans into compounds, scheduling corvée labor, and storing tribute in labyrinthine warehouses. Topa Inca knows better than to burn what he can inherit. When Chamor falls, he orders its systems preserved and translated into Inca idioms. Canals continue to flow, artisans continue to craft, warehouses continue to bulge, but now the tribute flows to Cusco, and the symbols of authority shift from Chamor's moons to Inti's sun. In absorbing Chamor, the empire gains not only land and people, but an entire administrative toolkit ready made for scale. The campaigns begin southward and westward, pressing against the Chincha, a maritime people whose fleets of balsa rafts skim the Pacific. Their wealth comes not from plows, but from the sea lanes that knit shell, fish, cotton, and metals into a network of trade stretching north into Ecuador and south along the desert fringe. Topa Inca does not dismiss them as primitive boatmen. He understands that an empire of mountains needs a navy of sorts, a way to reach and tax the abundance of the coast. He subdues the Chincha and folds their maritime lanes into the empire's arteries. Llamas carry tribute inland, but the rafts continue to move goods along the surf. their pilots now partners in a system that expands Cusco's reach without requiring the Incas to invent sails. The policy of resettlement intensifies. Mitmakuna, the colonists planted across conquered territory, are moved like living mortar. Whole communities are uprooted and transplanted into valleys where their loyalty will be tested by distance from their home gods and strengthened by dependence on Cusco's storehouses. Artisans are relocated to the capital and provincial centers where their skills can be deployed for imperial needs. The human map becomes as engineered as the road grid. Diversity is not allowed to harden into rebellion. It is diluted, redistributed, and reframed as imperial identity. Topa Inca travels with his court, a moving city of tents and banners, priests and record keepers, engineers and masons. His presence is both spectacle and audit. Where he goes, roads are straightened, terraces extended, and temples consecrated. His retinue ensures that every conquest is followed by construction, every victory by visible proof of inclusion. A valley may fall to spears in a week, but it is claimed for generations by the sight of a new fortress gleaming on a ridge and a new storehouse waiting to be filled. The empire does not just conquer, it builds until conquest feels inevitable. Law becomes standardized in this era. Ritual calendars are synchronized across regions, ensuring that distant communities celebrate on the empire's time. Festivals double as deadlines for tribute delivery, binding religious duty to civic obligation. Local gods are not erased, but given niches in imperial temples, where their voices are scheduled alongside Intas. The empire speaks in two registers at once. Your gods still matter, but they matter on our calendar. Your labor still feeds your kin, but it also feeds the state. By weaving local traditions into imperial ritual, Topa Inca ensures that resistance feels like blasphemy as much as rebellion. Cusco itself becomes a stage for the empire's new scale. Foreign elites are brought to the capital, paraded in festivals, seated in councils where their voices carry prestige but not sovereignty. They return home dazzled and bound, their loyalty reinforced by the memory of golden walls and endless granaries. The empire cultivates a reputation as a benefactor whose abundance dwarfs any local lord's ability to provide. Famine becomes less a natural disaster and more a political judgment. Cusco feeds those who obey, and starvation waits for those who resist. What began as a gamble in one valley now commands deserts, coasts, and highlands. Topa Inca has not merely expanded boundaries, he has stitched together worlds that once ignored each other, sailors and herders, desert farmers and cloud forest hunters, artisans of adobe palaces and shepherds of icy ridges. Each now speaks, however reluctantly, in the empire's grammar. Cusco has become not only the navel of the world, but the loom upon which the world's threads are woven into a single, deliberate fabric. By the end of Topa Inca's reign, the empire stretches from the shores of the Pacific deep into valleys and highlands, northward into territories where new dialects of Quechua mingle with older tongues, and southward into lands where cold and altitude test even hardened caravans. The road network is now a continental web. Couriers run with messages that cross climates and days. Storehouses punctuate the empire's body like organs, each one a reserve of calories and cloth that can be converted into soldiers' endurance. Fortresses crown ridges, their walls proclaiming permanence. The system is no longer an experiment, it is a habit, When Huayna Capac takes the fringe of empire into his grasp, the map is already swollen with valleys, deserts, and highlands subdued by his father and grandfather. His task is not to prove that the machine works, but to push it farther than anyone thought reasonable. He sets his eyes on the north, where rugged terrain and stubborn peoples promise both wealth and headaches. The gamble is clear: extend to wanton Suyu into Ecuador and Colombia, or watch rivals at the edge ferment into permanent threats. The North is not simply territory, it is a crucible where the empire will test its own limits. He marches with armies that behave less like raiding bands and more like rolling towns. Tens of thousands of men move in disciplined relay, supplied by the granaries and way stations already punctuating the road network. Engineers walk at the front with stonemasons, laying out fortresses even as battle plans are drawn. Wherever conquest touches ground, construction follows terraces etched into slopes, temples set to catch the sun at ritual hours, warehouses filled before the ink of surrender dries in memory. The army leaves behind not just garrisons but infrastructures, scaffolds of permanence that make rebellion feel like an inconvenience rather than a reversal. The northern lands resist. The Quitu and the Cañari know their valleys intimately, know which slopes can collapse under weight, which ridges make slings lethal, which forests can turn an imperial column into a desperate line. Campaigns drag. Victories must be earned more than once. Huayna Capac learns to make war into rhythm, strike hard, build quickly, resettle strategically, ritualize immediately. Conquered elites are invited into the empire's web, their gods transported to Cusco and honored beside Inte, their children educated in the capital until their loyalties knot in two directions. Defeated lands are seeded with colonists from other quarters, Mitmakuna, who dilute resistance and thicken dependency. The empire proves its strength, not in a single victory, but in repetition, in the ability to rebuild faster than opposition can recover. Quito becomes the jewel of this northern push. Huayna Capac raises it almost to the status of a second capital, lavishing it with palaces, plazas, and temples. His decision to base himself there for long stretches reveals both ambition and calculation. By placing himself closer to the frontier, he signals to both friend and enemy that the North is not a distant possession, but an integral quarter of the realm. The symbolism is clear. Cusco is eternal, but the empire can breathe through multiple lungs. Quito's prominence creates new patterns of movement, pulling labor, goods, and officials northward in cycles that make the empire feel less like a radial wheel and more like a woven mat, its strands stretched taut across mountains. The empire, at this point, runs on ritualized abundance. Storehouses brim so fully that famine feels like a foreign word. Runners stitch the vast body of Tawantinsuyu together with astonishing speed, carrying orders from Cusco or Quito to the farthest valleys in days. Quipucamayuks keep cords that hum with numbers. Head counts, herds, firsts, they can tell the state exactly how many men will be available for a campaign and how many days they can march before needing resupply. Confidence builds on this precision. To subjects, the state feels omniscient. To Huayna Capac, it feels invincible. Yet even invincibility can rot from within. As the northern campaigns continue, whispers of illness arrive with traders and prisoners. Diseases borne far away creep along the imperial roads, carried invisibly faster than any courier. Smallpox, a sickness the Andes have never known, spreads like a rumor that kills. Whole communities wither before imperial officials can count them. Tribute tallies collapse in regions already restless under occupation. Depopulation magnifies instability. The empire's strengths, the roads, the integration, the movement of goods and people become the vectors of its first great invisible enemy. Huayna Capac himself is struck down in the north. Intos differ on whether he dies in Quito or on the march, but the effect is the same. The empire loses a ruler at the height of his conquests, with no clear succession plan. His death leaves two sons with rival claims, one rooted in Cusco's ancient legitimacy, the other in Quito's fresh prestige. The gamble of making a northern capital suddenly looks like a trap, dividing loyalties between two poles that cannot easily reconcile. The system that seemed indestructible is now forced to choose between heirs in a moment of grief and confusion. In Huayna Capac's reign, the empire reached its maximum breadth, stretching thousands of kilometers from southern Chile to the edges of Colombia, commanding deserts, coasts, valleys, and forests. The roads ran without rival, the storehouses swelled, the temples glittered with gold, and the rituals synchronized tens of millions of lives. Yet at the very moment of triumph, the first cracks appeared. Disease slipped through the lattice unseen, succession hardened into rivalry, and the machine that had always consumed crisis and turned it into order faced a kind of threat it could not ritualize or resettle. The high tide had been reached, and in the wash of abundance lay the seeds of fracture. Behind the gleam of palaces and the noise of conquest, the empire functioned on three quiet pillars: food that refused famine, roads that erased distance, and numbers that disciplined memory. Without these, no king's ambition could have survived a single bad harvest or a single stubborn valley. With them, Tawantinsuyu became a machine that could move mountains by convincing men they were only moving stones. Food came first. The Andes are stingy, a geography of cliffs, frost, and thin air, where the careless starve quickly. The Inca response was not to curse the land, but to engineer it into obedience. Hills were sliced into terraces, each step braced by stone walls that caught soil and moisture, each stair a microclimate where maize, beans, and potatoes could thrive where flat land was absent. Raised fields in the high plains fought frost with water, using shallow canals to trap the sun by day and release its warmth by night, a thermal blanket for crops that would otherwise perish. Storage was just as ingenious. Granaries, or kolka, were built on windy ridges where cold air preserved dried potatoes, maize, quinoa, and jerky for years. In times of surplus, they filled like patient lungs. In times of hunger, they exhaled salvation. Distribution was organized by obligation. Households owed labor. The state owed security. When the rains betrayed or pests devoured, the state opened its bins and fed. People learned to see obedience, not as humiliation, but as insurance. Roads came next, stretching over mountains, deserts, and valleys until they formed a network longer than Rome's at its height. They were not paved with fantasy, they were hammered into reality by the steady application of midday labor, stones fitted, paths graded, suspension bridges woven from ichu grass swung across ravines so deep they seemed to drink sound. At intervals, Tampu way stations appeared like punctuation marks, stocked with food, clothing, weapons, and blankets. Messengers, known as chasquas, sprinted in relays, carrying knotted cords and memorized words at speeds that turned days into hours. An order born in Cusco could arrive in Quito before a rival lord even knew his border had been crossed. Armies marched not into wilderness, but into prepared corridors, their hunger fed by granaries, their exhaustion soothed by tampu. To an enemy, the empire seemed to move with uncanny speed. To the Inca, it was simply the math of distance, disciplined by habit. And math was the quiet heart. Without writing, the empire could still count, and count precisely. The quipu was their ledger, a bundle of cords, dyed in colors, each strand carrying knots, placed with deliberate spacing. To outsiders, it looked like ornament, but to trained eyes, it was a library. Numbers of men, weights of harvest, obligations of districts, victories, and losses all could be encoded and recited. Quipucameocs, the keepers of cords, were more than accountants. They were priests of certainty, trained to cross check each other, rehearsing inventories in public until trust became habit. Their cords allowed the state to remember across distances where gossip died. With Quipus, Cusco could know how many men a valley could supply, how many jars of beer a festival would require, how many blankets a garrison would need for winter. The cords were not abstract, they were the empire's spine of data. Together, food, roads, and math created a rhythm. A farmer planted on a terrace and knew his surplus would be counted, stored, and redistributed. A runner carried a cord and knew another would take it from his hand before his breath failed. A steward opened a granary and knew the community would bless the state that kept hunger away. Empire did not live in gold walls or jeweled idols. It lived in the daily trust that the system worked, that obedience meant security, that one's labor became another's bread, and another's labor would one day become one's own rescue. That trust was worth more than fear, and it was the reason millions accepted Cusco's commands as though they were as inevitable as sunrise. If roads and storehouses kept the empire's body alive, belief gave it a soul and a reason to move. The Inca state was not shy about its theology. At its center stood Inti, the sun, whose golden face glittered from the walls of the Caricancha temple in Cusco. Priests tended him with rituals timed to solstices and equinoxes, his light mirrored in sheets of hammered gold that bathed the sanctuary in brilliance. To stand in that temple was to stand inside daylight, even at night, a reminder that the empire's authority was as natural and undeniable as the sun's journey across the sky. Inti was father, patron, and partner, and the Sapa Inca claimed his bloodline directly from this source. Rulership was sanctified as divine inheritance. Politics and theology fused so tightly they could not be pried apart. But Inti was not alone. The empire's genius lay in incorporating local gods rather than trying to erase them. Conquered peoples saw their deities carried to Cusco, installed in shrines near the great temple, their festivals preserved, but now scheduled according to imperial time. The message was clear. Your God still matters, but he sings in our choir, and his voice harmonizes with Inti's. Submission was softened by recognition, resistance diluted by ritual inclusion. A valley lord, whose huaca stood in Cusco's temple precinct, could not easily rebel. To strike against Cusco would be to strike against his own ancestral protector. The dead ruled with nearly as much authority as the living. Inca kings did not simply pass into memory, they lingered as mummies, dressed in fine textiles, seated in their palaces, treated as active participants in politics. Their estates remained intact. Their servants continued to work. Their fields continued to feed. Councils debated as if the departed sovereigns still listened, their opinions interpreted by priests and attendants. Ancestor worship became a perpetual drain on resources, but also a perpetual justification for expansion. Each ruler had to carve out new lands and new labor to sustain his own cult, because his predecessor's estate remained locked to the past. This principle, split inheritance, was not a quirk, it was an engine. It ensured that every generation of kings pushed outward, seizing new valleys, new herds, new fields to fund their afterlife. Stagnation was impossible. Conquest was ritualized necessity. Kapakacha ceremonies carried the empire's reach even farther. Children chosen for their purity were led in processions to distant peaks, clothed in the finest garments, fed lavishly, honored with songs and gifts, and then sacrificed on mountain tops that became eternal shrines. To later eyes, this seems cruel, but to the Inca, it was reciprocity at its most exalted, the most precious lives offered to bind heaven and earth, empire and cosmos. These rituals stitched the furthest provinces into the imperial fabric, each mountaintop shrine a point of connection, each offering a reminder that even the sky recognized Cusco's authority. Women's labor was absorbed into belief as well. The Ecclesias, houses of chosen women, wove fine textiles, brewed sacred chicha, and prepared offerings that carried prestige equal to gold. Their work was framed as holy service, their products as vehicles of cosmic balance. Cloth was not merely clothing, it was condensed ritual, a token of loyalty, a contract in fiber. To gift a tunic woven in Cusco was to send more than warmth. It was to send a piece of the empire's sanctity, a reminder that even the thread one wore was spun into the empire's ideology. Thus the empire bound itself with more than stone. It bound itself with light, with ancestors who never died, with rituals that carried obedience into the bones of children and the fibers of cloth. Belief was not decoration on top of politics. It was politics written in the language of eternity. To obey the Inca was not simply to follow a man, it was to walk in step with the sun, to honor the ancestors who still watched, to participate in cycles that would outlast the living, and to rule was to feed those cycles with new conquests, new offerings, new estates, so that the machinery of faith and expansion could never stall. The empire could not survive on ritual alone. It had to master war, not only as destruction, but as a system of persuasion. The Inca did not field armies that lived perpetually in barracks. Instead, they summoned troops through the Mita, calling peasants from their fields for seasons of campaigning, feeding them from the state's granaries, arming them with slings, spears, clubs, and bolas, and drilling them into formations that turned villagers into regiments. The weapon most feared was not the sword but the sling. A stone hurled from a trained hand could crack a skull at distances where arrows faltered, and Inca slingers grew up with the weapon in their palms, shepherding herds and defending terraces long before they marched as soldiers. Against them, even armored enemies could find themselves staggered. Yet, war was never only about the clash. It was about how quickly the clash could be absorbed into order. The Empire's engineers followed close behind the fighters, raising fortresses on ridges that commanded valleys, laying out roads that bound new conquests to Cusco's web, stockpiling food so that a newly subjected province would see imperial abundance before its wounds had healed. Places like Sakahaman, with its zigzag walls of stone blocks larger than oxen, embodied this philosophy. These fortresses were not only redoubts against enemies, they were monuments to permanence, statements in stone that rebellion would be futile because the empire could build faster than it could be undone. Intelligence networks softened resistance before the first spear was thrown. Envoys traveled ahead of armies, promising gifts, security, and inclusion in the imperial festival cycle to those who submitted peacefully. They warned of what refusal meant: forced relocation, destroyed crops, the confiscation of sacred objects. Most elites understood the calculation. To keep their status, they bent early, offering their sons as hostages and their daughters as brides, allowing their gods to be relocated to Cusco. The empire excelled at this delicate coercion. By the time soldiers arrived, resistance was often already frayed, the local nobility too entangled with Cusco to risk annihilation. Quechua spread along with Rhodes, not as a campaign of suppression, but as a practical lingua franca. It was taught to the children of elites in Cusco, carried back in their tongues to distant valleys, and reinforced in administration and ritual. Local languages survived, but Quechua became the empire's grammar of power. Through it, orders could be standardized, rituals synchronized, obligations made comprehensible across thousands of kilometers. To speak Quechua was to acknowledge the empire's presence, to join a chorus where even defiance had to borrow imperial words. When outright destruction was necessary, it was swift. Villages that resisted too stubbornly were burned, their people dispersed in resettlement waves that erased their ability to organize. But more often, the empire chose to rewire rather than erase. Elites were reinstalled under imperial titles, their gods given space in Cusco's temple precincts, their communities tied into the Sikh system so that their festivals now served the empire's calendar. Submission was staged as elevation. Yesterday's rivals paraded in today's festival, their loyalty made public by their place in the procession. The people learned quickly that conquest was not always ruin, but often a reshuffling in which survival depended on cooperation. The duality of Inca war lay in this balance: brutal efficiency when resistance was absolute, and patient assimilation when cooperation was possible. Fortresses, slings, and discipline provided the iron, hostages, feasts, and the quiet spread of language provided the silk. Together they created an empire that did not need to fight every battle because its reputation, its roads, and its rituals fought for it. In the Andes, where famine and frost had always been the true enemies, a state that promised food, order, and continuity could make its spears sharper by rarely having to use them. The empire at its height had never been so large, nor so fragile. When Huayna Capac died, likely of smallpox that had seeped into the Andes along invisible threads of trade and conquest, he left no uncontested heir. Two sons stood ready to claim the mantle, each carrying different strengths, each commanding different loyalties. Huáscar, raised in Cusco, embodied the capital's legitimacy, the weight of ritual, the approval of ancient lineages and priests. Atahualpa, raised in the north near Quito, embodied the vigor of the frontier, the loyalty of hardened generals, and the momentum of recent campaigns. What followed was not simply a quarrel between brothers, it was a civil war that tore the empire down its spine. Huascar moved first, cloaking himself in tradition. He claimed the sun's blessing through the rituals of Cusco, enthroned in the Coricancha, where golden walls reflected his right to rule. Priests and nobles lent him weight, but his authority outside the capital was thin. To tighten his grasp, he demanded tribute and hostages from the northern provinces. The demand was not unreasonable by imperial standards, yet the timing was poison. The North had tasted a kind of autonomy under Huayna Capac's long residence in Quito, and Atahualpa had become more than a prince there. He was a warlord wrapped in loyalty, a commander whose victories had fed armies and whose gifts had bound generals. When Huascar's summons arrived, northern lords calculated the risk and chose to resist. Atahualpa answered with soldiers rather than words. His armies were leaner, seasoned from years of fighting stubborn valleys in the north. They moved quickly along the roads, supplied by warehouses that had been stocked during Huayna Capac's campaigns. Generals like Chalcuchimic and Quizquiz, men who had learned to think in terms of speed and annihilation, carried out his strategy with ruthless efficiency. Battles became massacres. Huascar's forces, assembled hastily from central and southern provinces, faltered against disciplined northern veterans. Defeat bred panic, and panic fed atrocity. Victories by Atahualpa's commanders were followed by brutal purges of Huascar's supporters, nobles executed, lineages uprooted, priests silenced. The war was not just fought on fields, but in the memory of every province, where the choice of loyalty could mean feasting today or annihilation tomorrow. Cusco itself reeled. Huascar, desperate to reassert control, executed many nobles he suspected of wavering. His purge only deepened resentment. By the time Atahualpa's armies pushed south, the capital was brittle. Huascar was captured in battle, paraded as a prisoner, a living symbol of how far the empire had fractured. Atahualpa had won, but the victory came at a catastrophic cost. The empire's administrative class was gutted, its ritual continuity broken, its nobles divided between fear of the conqueror and grief for the defeated. Storehouses still brimmed, roads still gleamed across ridges, but the trust that made the system breathe had been poisoned. The war left scars far deeper than territory lost or won. Families were split across loyalties, entire lineages extinguished, temples robbed of their priests, and the sense of inevitability that once protected the Inca from rebellion dissolved into suspicion. The empire had always been more than its armies. It was belief in the balance of moieties, the benevolence of storehouses, the fairness of rotational labor, the sanctity of rituals that bound sun and soil. Civil war cracked each of these. Where once there had been confidence that the system could outlast kings, now there was only proof that kings could devour the system. When Atahualpa stood triumphant, he ruled an empire in name, but a corpse in spirit. He controlled the generals, the armies, the roads, and the warehouses, but the rituals were hollow, the elite families shattered, the legitimacy of Cusco compromised. It was at this moment of exhaustion, with the empire stretched, divided, and weakened by its own success, that strangers from across the sea arrived. Their timing could not have been more exact. The Andes had never seen enemies like them, but the Brothers' War had already ensured that the Inca world was fighting itself long before the first Spanish horse set hoof on Andean soil. The moment that breaks the world does not arrive with thunder, but with a handful of bearded men leading strange beasts across the mountains. To the Inca, the Spaniards are uncanny, metal clad riders on animals that turn men taller than llamas, carrying weapons that spit fire and thunder, crossing landscapes with audacity that suggests either madness or divine sanction. Yet their numbers are pitiful, barely 200, a fraction of what the empire can summon from a single province. What makes them lethal is timing. They walk into a land already torn apart, a civil war still smoldering, with Huascar imprisoned and Atahualpa triumphant but unsteady. The system that once absorbed shock has been exhausted by brothers who treated it as a prize rather than a covenant. Into this fatigue ride the Spaniards. Atahualpa meets them at Cajamarca, confident, curious, disdainful. He arrives with an entourage so vast that the plaza cannot contain it. He intends to test the strangers, perhaps to intimidate them, perhaps to gauge what kind of tribute they deserve. Instead, he finds himself caught in a trap. The Spaniards spring an ambush with steel, horses, and cannon roar. Panic rips through his unarmed retinue, thousands cut down in the crush of confusion. Atahualpa himself is seized, not killed, held aloft like a trophy. The paradox is sudden and devastating. The Sapa Inca, son of the sun, embodiment of divine order, sits caged by men whose names no one knew a week before. To the Inca world, this is not just defeat, it is cosmic dissonance. If the ruler can be seized, then perhaps the sun itself can be mocked. The ransom becomes legend. Atahualpa offers to fill a room with gold and silver, floor to ceiling, in exchange for freedom. Couriers race to temples and shrines across the empire, stripping walls, emptying storerooms, hauling treasures on llamas and men's backs. The wealth of generations piles into Cajamarca, a flood of gold so immense that Spaniards later melt it into bars, obliterating gods and artistry alike. Yet ransom buys nothing. Atahualpa is executed, strangled after a farcical trial. The act shatters not just his body, but the empire's faith and negotiation. The Spanish have shown that promises are only snares. From that moment, every Inca noble must weigh whether to resist or collaborate, knowing that mercy is not on offer. Cusco falls soon after. Spanish arms are not what take it. Spanish cunning and Inca division, the generals loyal to Atahualpa, and remnants of Huascar's faction, both hesitate, calculating survival. The city, once navel of the world, is looted. Temples are stripped, palaces seized, storehouses plundered, yet conquest is not clean. Resistance stiffens in the highlands, where Manco Inca rallies those still loyal to the old order. He stages a great rebellion, laying siege to Cusco with tens of thousands of warriors. Sling stones rain against Spanish walls, flames lick wooden roofs, and for months the invaders huddle like animals cornered by a storm. Victory hangs within reach, but divisions within the Inca ranks, Spanish reinforcements arriving along the coast, and the relentless spread of disease tilt the balance. The siege collapses. Cusco remains in foreign hands. Manco retreats, not into obscurity, but into resistance. He flees into the Vilcabamba region, where jungle and mountain weave together into a natural fortress. There he raises a neo-Inca state, a last redoubt that refuses to accept that the empire has ended. For decades it survives, raiding, negotiating, staging rituals that claim continuity even as Spanish rule thickens in the valleys. The memory of Tawantinsuyu is kept alive in Vilcabamba, a stubborn ember that insists the sun's children are not yet extinguished. The Spaniards, meanwhile, entrench their system. They impose encomiendas, parceling out communities to conquistadors as tribute labor. Churches rise on the foundations of temples, bells replacing drums, crosses planted where huacas once received offerings. Yet the old rhythms do not vanish. Farmers still plant terraces on the empire's schedule. Roads still carry goods. Quechua lingers as lingua franca, too useful to erase. The state dies, but its skeleton remains, and Spaniards walk roads they did not build, tax terraces they did not cut, and exploit storehouses they did not design. Conquest is brutal, but it is parasitic as much as creative, feeding off the very system it destroyed. In 1572, the ember is finally stamped out. Spanish forces march into Vilcabamba, seize Tupac Amaru, the last Inca ruler, and execute him in Cusco's plaza. With his death, dynastic sovereignty ends. The mummies of past rulers are burned, their estates confiscated, their cults silenced. For the Spaniards, this is closure, the last signature on conquest. For the Andean people, it is the beginning of a long twilight in which empire becomes memory, resistance becomes rebellion, and the sun, though hidden, continues to shine behind mountains and stories. The siege years reveal a truth sharper than steel. No empire, however vast, can endure if it fractures from within. The Spaniards did not defeat a united Inca realm, they exploited a world already bleeding. Yet the Inca did not vanish. They retreated into valleys, into rituals, into memory, carrying with them the habits of terraces, the cadence of festivals, the language of cords and cloth. The body was broken, but the pulse never stopped. With the capture and execution of Tupac Amaru in 1572, the last ember of dynastic resistance was extinguished. The Vilcabamba court was broken, its temples razed, its royal bloodline paraded and silenced. To Spanish eyes, this was an ending, the final act in a conquest story. Yet for the Andean world, it was not an end, but a transformation. The empire dissolved as a state, but its bones, roads, terraces, rituals, and language remained too deeply ingrained to be erased. What followed was centuries of negotiation, rebellion, and endurance, the Inca legacy reappearing in new forms long after the golden walls of Cusco had been stripped. The Spaniards reorganized life into reducciones, planned settlements where dispersed communities were forced together under church bells and priestly supervision. The aim was control, easier taxation, easier evangelization, easier labor drafts for mines and estates. The Mita, once the empire's proud system of shared labor, was resurrected in harsher form, funneling Andean men into the silver mines of Potosi, where mercury fumes and collapses consumed lives by the thousands. What had once been reciprocity became exploitation. What had once been ritual duty became coerced servitude. And yet, even within this harshness, echoes of the old order survived. Communities continued to work terraces, to repair canals, to plant on the imperial schedule, because those rhythms had become second nature. Spaniards demanded tribute, but the land itself still whispered Inca laws of timing and reciprocity. Language proved more enduring than crowns. Quechua, spread by the empire as administrative glue, outlasted the state itself. Missionaries, recognizing its utility, adopted it for evangelization, producing catechisms and sermons in the tongue of the conqueror's subjects. Centuries later, Quechua would still be spoken by millions, a linguistic empire hidden beneath colonial rule. In villages scattered across Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and beyond, prayers mixed Catholic saints with huacas, hymns with ancestral invocations. The Spanish cross stood in plazas, but behind it the sea system's memory lingered, each shrine remembered, each mountain treated as kin. Christianity did not erase Andean belief. It was absorbed, translated, hybridized, until the Andes carried both sun and cross in one breath. Rebellions punctuated this long twilight. In the late 18th century, another Tupac Amaru, Jose Gabriel Condor Canqui, claiming descent from the old dynasty, rose in revolt. His uprising shook the highlands, rallying tens of thousands against colonial abuses, demanding justice in the name of a broken empire. Though crushed, it terrified Spanish authorities and left a scar that never healed. Tupac Amaru II became a symbol not only of lost Inca sovereignty, but of enduring Andean dignity, invoked centuries later by independence leaders who sought to break colonial chains. His rebellion proved that the Inca legacy was not museum dust. It was a reservoir of power that could be tapped whenever oppression grew unbearable. The material inheritance of the Inca never disappeared. Roads, many still visible today, continued to carry feet, hooves, and wheels. Terraces climbed hillsides long after Cusco's kings were gone, their stones stubborn against erosion, their logic irresistible to farmers who knew they worked. Bridges of woven grass were rebuilt every year in ritual reenactments that tied modern villagers to their imperial ancestors. Even as republics replaced colonies, the physical infrastructure of Tawantinsuyu endured, silent and steadfast. In moments of crisis, famines, revolutions, droughts, communities still turned to these ancient tools, proof that empire had left not just memory, but usable inheritance. In Cusco itself, the transformation was stark. Spanish churches rose on Inca foundations, cathedrals swallowing temples, convents occupying palaces, yet the stones beneath refused to vanish. Earthquakes toppled colonial walls, but the Inca masonry beneath held firm, as if the earth itself respected its own engineers more than foreign architects. Tourists centuries later would marvel at the seams so tight a blade could not enter. But for Andean eyes, these were not ruins. They were reminders, still alive, that their ancestors had mastered mountains in ways that no conquest could undo. The Inca legacy continues into the present. In Bolivia, Ecuador, and Peru, Quechua and Aymara words shape daily speech. Festivals timed to solstices echo the old rituals of sun and season, now dressed in Catholic garb, but carrying unmistakable Andean rhythm. Farmers still tend terraces, still exchange labor through Aini, still trust reciprocity more than currency. Even in urban centers, the figure of the Inca lingers as both pride and protest, an emblem of sovereignty lost, but also of endurance. Modern states invoke Inca heritage for tourism and nationalism, while communities invoke it for dignity and survival. The empire's body is gone, but its pulse thrums in language, labor, belief, and stone. Thus, the story of Tawantinsuyu does not end in 1572. It continues in hidden calendars, in mountain shrines still fed with offerings, in children raised to speak Quechua before Spanish, in rebels who take up the name of Tupac Amaru as if it were a torch. In truth, they had only ended a dynasty. The empire of the sun lingers wherever terraces catch rain, wherever cords of memory are knotted, wherever mountains are treated as kin, and wherever people insist that survival is not silence. The Inca civilization endures not as a state, but as a language, a practice, a faith and reciprocity, in a stubborn geometry of stone that has outlasted conquest, republics, and centuries. Its afterlife is not nostalgia, it is presence, as real as the walls that still hold Cusco upright when the earth shakes.